Minister Graceful.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all the members for their support of the bill. Earlier, Minister Graceful has highlighted the urgent need for the world to address climate change. Singapore is firmly committed to doing our part in the global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And to meet our climate commitments, we have put in place a robust suite of measures to support our companies to decarbonize. The carbon tax form a key part of this effort. It prices carbon to guide investment decisions by companies and spurs companies to reduce their emissions while giving them the flexibility to do so in a way that makes the most economic sense. As climate action gains greater urgency globally, the transition towards lower carbon and carbon neutral operations will increasingly become a prerequisite for consumers, for investors. Hence, it is in the company's commercial interest to decarbonize, and in the same way, it is also critical for Singapore to transit to a low-carbon economy to maintain our long-term economic competitiveness, to remain an attractive investment and business destination, as reminded by Ms. Janet Ang, Mr. C.A. Yao-Chen, and many other members during their very passionate speech earlier, and to ensure good jobs for Singaporeans, good jobs created here in Singapore. We have sought public and the industry feedback on the draft Carbon Pricing Amendment Bill. The majority of the respondents acknowledge the role of an appropriate price signal for carbon in order to enable the low-carbon transition. For example, some respondents will favour a more aggressive carbon tax trajectory, given the latest recommendations by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for stronger actions to reach the Paris Agreement goals and the urgency to reduce rising greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, some companies are concerned that the higher carbon tax will add to the cost pressures, especially for the export-oriented companies that have to compete with those from jurisdictions with lower or no effective carbon price. Apart from the public consultation and since the announcement of the changes to carbon tax earlier this year, we have been engaging businesses that will be directly impacted by the increase. We appreciate their feedback that they recognize the need for an appropriate carbon price, but they are also concerned about the impact of higher carbon taxes on their operating costs and competitiveness. We hear and we understand their need for time to make the necessary investment and changes to transit towards greener operations. This is especially so for companies that depend on low-carbon technologies which are still under development, like CCUS, carbon capture, utilization storage, like low-carbon hydrogen, that some of the speakers talk about, Ms. Po Lee San, Mr. Cheng Sheng Yao, Mr. C.A. Yao-Chen. So I want to assure the House that in designing the carbon tax framework, we have taken into consideration all these varying views and feedback. And I want to assure the House that we will continue engaging companies on their sustainability journey, including our SMEs, our LLEs. So let me now respond to the points raised by the members on the impact of the carbon tax on businesses and how the government is committed to actively supporting our companies as they adjust to the revised carbon tax regime. Firstly, I want to highlight that under the carbon tax regime, only facilities that directly emit at least 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases annually will be subject to the carbon tax. Now, in this way, the carbon tax is targeted to apply to key nodes of emissions in our economy. It will cover about 80% of our total carbon emissions. Businesses that are large emitters, for example, in the energy and chemical sectors, will be directly impacted by the carbon tax. We recognize the challenges that the companies face, especially amid other increasingly tough operating conditions. The impact of the revised carbon tax regime will be especially pronounced for companies in the emissions-intensive, trade-exposed, in short, EITE sectors, such as the chemicals, as well as the semiconductor sectors. Ms. Janet Ang earlier, and also Mr. Xie Yaoquan during their speeches, reminded us that these companies compete globally and face competition from counterparts in jurisdictions which have lower or in fact no carbon price. In addition, many jurisdictions with carbon prices offer generous allowances and support to companies in the EITE sectors to protect their business competitiveness. The allowances provided could cover as high as 100% of the company's emissions in some of these countries. Now, it is with these factors in mind that the government decided to announce the changes to our carbon tax rates ahead of time. We have spelled out the rates for up to 2027 and provided a range for up to 2030. This demonstrates our commitment to work closely with the industry to make the green transition as smooth as possible. And by providing companies with advance notice, we hope it will facilitate their business decisions and plans for decarbonization. During her passionate speech, Ms. Janet Ang reminded us that many of these EITE companies have placed significant, substantial investment in Singapore that continue to provide good jobs, secure jobs for Singaporeans and contribute to our economic growth. So the sustainability journey is one that we walk together, and we seek to smoothen the transition path for companies by providing the necessary support for their decarbonization while maintaining Singapore's competitive edge. Hence, we will introduce a transition framework which will provide eligible companies with transitory allowance for a portion of their emissions. Members Mr. Don Wee and Mr. Leon Pereira have asked if the transition framework will erode the price signal for companies to decarbonize and if the framework should be tightened. Let me assure the members that the transition framework will not give a free pass to the companies. The transition framework will not give a free pass to the companies because Singapore has committed to enhancing our 2030 NDC, nationally determined contributions, to reduce our emissions to around 60 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2030, and that's after peaking emissions earlier, and to achieve net zero by year 2050. This means that the Singapore government is accountable to these international climate commitments, and hence, we will ensure that the transition framework will effectively, robustly drive the companies to decarbonize. To address Mr. Don Wee's concern, we will work with the companies, including the large emitters, to ensure that they have decarbonization plans aligned with Singapore's net zero commitment. We are mindful that the transition allowance provided will not run counter to our long-term goal. And I want to assure and emphasize that the amount of the allowances provided will only be for a portion of the company's emissions. And this will be determined based on internationally recognized efficiency benchmark where available, or based on the facility's decarbonization plans. Now, this means that any emissions that's above the allowances will still be taxed at the prevailing carbon tax rate. Now, in time, when appropriate, the government will also release aggregated information on the amount of allowances provided. But I think members have also raised, and they understand, that we will need to bear in mind considerations such as whether such disclosures would inadvertently divulge commercially sensitive information. To address Mr. Don Wee's query, the allowances are only provided for the carbon tax and are not tradable. In addition, the allowances will also be reviewed regularly against how the companies have fared against the efficiency benchmark where available or based on their decarbonization plans. Earlier in their speeches, Mr. Cheng Xing Yao and Ms. Janet Ang spoke about the need to ensure that we are not being too prescriptive. And I agree with them. We agree with them. We need to ensure that the framework retains some flexibility, adaptability to ensure that as we transit into a low-carbon future, Singapore remains a compelling, attractive business and investment location here so that we can create good jobs, including new green jobs for Singaporeans. We will also take into consideration international developments as well as technological developments of decarbonization technologies, including CCUS, low-carbon hydrogen, much like how Ms. Janet Ang spoke about the need to consider the state of technology development in determining the allowances. So I can assure her that we will keep our eyes and ears very close on the global development, not just the efficiency standards, but also low-carbon technologies development. Furthermore, only existing investments and commitments will be eligible for transitory allowances. Many of these investments were made amidst a very different operating context and would require time for them to transit, for them to make the necessary investment to ease into a lower carbon operations. Now, without transitory support, there will be a significant near-term impact on their competitiveness. So the transitory support would especially help the companies that have made large capital investments in Singapore and have contributed to our economic story and the growth of jobs here in Singapore. The transition framework will also help to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage, a risk that many of the members spoke about in their speeches, so that we can avoid companies shifting operations to other jurisdictions with lower or no effective carbon price. Members reminded us today as we debate this bill, Singapore is the only country in Southeast Asia to implement a carbon price regime. So we want to make sure we mitigate any risk of carbon leakage, because such an outcome actually would lead to loss of jobs, loss of economic value add in Singapore with no overall global reduction in emissions if there is carbon leakage. Mr. Louis Ng, in his earlier speech, Ms. Po Lee San asked about the period of transition that will be provided to companies in the EITE sectors. I want to assure them that we will calibrate the duration of the transition framework based on international standards, developments, and technological developments of decarbonization techniques. Now, we are very aware that the carbon prices in other jurisdictions are not static. Some may continue to remain very low, and in some cases, no prices for certain sectors at all, while others may raise their carbon prices more aggressively. We are keeping a very close eye on that. We also recognize that companies will need time to transit to low carbon operations. The government will consider all these factors when calibrating the transition framework. We will also inform companies in advance of the changes to facilitate business planning. Mr. Leon Pereira earlier proposed that the allowances be awarded only to facilities that have received allowances for no more than one of the 4 preceding emission years. I want to share with him that companies shared with us during the consultation that they need time. They need time to develop and implement new technologies to decarbonize and transform their operations, and these efforts could take a couple of years. Hence, restricting allowances in a manner that's suggested will not provide the support that's needed by the companies, nor meet the intended objective of the transition framework. Mr. Leon Pereira also proposed that the awards of allowances include information such as the reasons for awarding the allowances be listed on the public registry. Members will appreciate, earlier on, Ms. Janet Ang shared about that it may be unwise, right? Members will appreciate that doing so may reveal commercially sensitive information about a facility's scale of operation, revenue, etc., and may over time really erode Singapore's competitiveness as a business and investment location. And then at the end of the day, it will affect our ability to create good jobs for Singaporeans. I have earlier stated Singapore government will in time release aggregated information on the amount of allowances provided. I've also explained the reasons and the basis for awarding the allowances earlier. Mr. Don Wee earlier also asked if Singapore is considering a CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, a CBAM proposes a carbon tariff on carbon-intensive imports to stem carbon leakage to countries without a carbon price. We currently have no plans to introduce a CBAM because as a small market, putting in place tariff barriers would disadvantage our very own companies and have a limited impact on stemming carbon leakage. Now, having said that, we'll continue to monitor the global developments on CBAM and calibrate our position accordingly. Mr. Cheng Xing Yao and Mr. Mark Che spoke about the need to ensure energy security, resilience, and to preserve optionality as Singapore moves towards our net zero vision. I fully agree with them because energy security is always at the top of our mind, even as we seek to decarbonize our grid. For example, as we scale up electricity imports, we will put in place sufficient backup generation capacity to ensure a continuous supply, even in the event of disruptions. Many members also spoke about how we recently announced our national hydrogen strategy. Indeed, like what Mr. Cheng Xing Yao, Ms. Po Li San, and other members have said, hydrogen can complement and diversify our power mix alongside with solar, alongside with imported electricity, as well as other potential low-carbon energy sources. So in importing hydrogen, like other energy sources, we will adopt a diversified portfolio to ensure energy security, to ensure energy resilience. We are pressing ahead with the development of such low-carbon alternatives, which will provide more options for businesses and consumers seeking to purchase renewable energy. But even so, and especially in the interim, I think you will agree with us that businesses, consumers, in fact, all of us must play a part and improve energy efficiency and optimize and reduce energy consumption. Ms. Po Li San and Mr. Xie Yao Quan, Ms. Janet Ang, and Mr. Mark Che ask about the support for companies that are paying higher electricity prices either due to the current energy situation or indirectly due to the carbon tax. We understand the challenges that our businesses are facing. We recognize that the companies will be affected by the indirect impact of the carbon tax through electricity prices. Earlier on, 2M Tan Si Ling addressed many of these energy PQs and shared with the House. As Singapore imports more than 90% of our energy needs, we cannot be fully insulated from developments, including volatility in the global energy market. And this is why we have adopted a calibrated approach of right pricing electricity to help encourage prudent use of electricity. At the same time, we will continue to support our businesses, our SMEs, to make more sustainable business decisions. For instance, we have schemes to help our companies, our SMEs, improve their energy efficiency, which will in turn reduce their energy costs as well as the indirect impact of carbon tax. Now, this includes the Resource Efficiency Grant for Emission, in short, REGE, that's administered by the EDB, as well as the Energy Efficiency Fund, administered by the NEA. Now, let me just quickly cite two projects very quickly. Now, one project under the REGE scheme it supported the replacement of a facility's existing chiller system with a more energy efficient one, achieving an energy savings of more than 3,600 megawatt hour. Now, what does it mean? This is equivalent to an abatement of over 1,700 tons of carbon emission annually. And this is one REGE project. So we want to encourage our companies to come on board the various schemes, whether it's REGE or the Energy Efficiency Fund or the more recently rolled out Energy Efficiency Grant. Now, to Mr. Mark Che's query, we also regularly review the schemes to assess if updates and refinements are needed. We want to keep them relevant. We want to make sure they are accessible to our SMEs. Now, for example, the Energy Efficiency Fund was just enhanced about 6 months ago in April this year. What did we do? We raised the grant support cap for for adoption of energy efficiency technologies from what used to be 50%, we raise it to 70% of the qualifying cost. NEA has also recently simplified the grant application as well as the disbursement process for the standard retrofit projects. So this makes it easier for SMEs, for companies to apply and to benefit from the Energy Efficiency Fund. Let me give you another quick example to show that even micro enterprises, smaller SMEs can come on board. Now, this example is a local company that has benefited from Energy Efficiency Fund, and the company name is Kawarin Enterprise Private Limited. Now, this is a steel manufacturing company. Now, with the support from Energy Efficiency Fund, Kawarin upgraded their old air compressor to more energy efficient models. Now, so you ask, what's the benefits? This has allowed Kawarin Enterprise Private Limited to enjoy annual cost savings of more than 30,000 Sing dollars, 30,000 Sing dollars, and abated about 48 tons of carbon annually. And that is just one Energy Efficiency Fund project. So I hope the members in the House will help us share this information and allow more SMEs and local companies to benefit from all this array of programs that we've availed to them. Now, I want to assure the House that the government will continue to monitor overall costs for businesses, which could be driven by many factors. We discussed about that besides the carbon tax. And MTI and the economic agencies stand ready to provide more assistance where needed. Mr. Speaker, sir, the government remains fully committed to working with our industries on their decarbonisation journey to become more sustainable and more competitive in a low-carbon economy. Because by working in partnership and taking the necessary bold steps today, we can chart Singapore's transformation towards a greener and more sustainable future together. Thank you.